In this video I'm going to discuss comments made by Quentin Tarantino about Bruce Lee on the Joe Rogan show. I'm going to explain why in my opinion what Quentin is saying is not only absurd but even contradicts his own movie. First I'm going to deal with the disrespect though. Joe Rogan correctly brought up the controversy over how Quentin had depicted Bruce Lee in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, saying that Quentin had made Bruce appear like an asshole. Quentin states that he understands that Bruce's daughter might have a problem with it, but he says anyone else can go suck a dick. But if that's the case, Quentin, why didn't you demonstrate some common decency and check how Shannon Lee felt about this before making a mockery of her father in the movie? And the obvious question is, what has Linda, Bruce's widow, done to Quentin for him not to have considered her feelings too? Quentin claims to know so much about Bruce Lee. Did he forget Bruce was married? I don't think so, he just didn't care. Of course, we could go on to name many other living friends of Bruce who Quentin thinks need to exchange lollipops for part of the male anatomy, and Bruce's admirers, many of whom Bruce has inspired to live far more productive lives than they would have done otherwise. So Quentin moves on, explaining that Cliff, the fictional stuntman in the movie, obviously tricked Bruce. He then gives a plug to his book, saying it's explained more, and moves on to a brief description of the contest, which is a 2 falls out of 3. Apparently this fictional character loved playing tricks. Well, anyone who knows anything about Bruce Lee knows that Bruce Lee liked playing tricks too. Cliff apparently has a method. Yes, Quentin, a method that might fool a Labrador but not a Springer Spaniel. And his method is to give the guy the first fall. Okay. Cliff gives no resistance whatsoever, and apparently Bruce Lee, who is very streetwise and well educated, is going to be fooled by this, but will give Quentin, with his super high IQ, the benefit of doubt. After all, he wrote the book. So Bruce knocks Cliff over, and then Quentin comes out with this ridiculous claim that most of the time, if someone has a particular move, they'll do it again. Really? But surely not to the same person immediately after the first attack. You might try that with someone completely different, who hasn't seen it before. Anyway, Joe diverts onto a discussion about Jean LaBelle and history there, and Tarantino then comes out with another absurd comment after Joe asks him if he's done any research. Apparently, Tarantino had always known it. Quentin Tarantino was born in March 1963, and the first episode of The Green Hornet was aired in September 1966, when Quentin was 3.5 years old. So while most toddlers are getting to grips with being able to use a toilet instead of a potty, Quentin was what? Receiving memos from Hollywood stuntmen saying, "Bruce hit me." I'm not convinced. Most likely people started bad-mouthing Bruce after he died and wasn't around to give his version of events, and Quentin got these stories after they embellished for 20 years. At this point, Quentin is about as plausible as Steven Seagal, and maybe even less so. Also, there's a difference between tagging and hitting, so here again we have Quentin contradicting himself to a degree. Joe Rogan's response here is that he clearly wasn't buying into any of this nonsense. Anyway, after slagging Bruce off over his alleged assaults on Hollywood stuntmen, Quentin now returns to the mythical Cliff, the fictional Hollywood stuntman, and we have some truly epic contradictions from Quentin. So Quentin tells us that Cliff is a hand-to-hand combat killer. Well, he is in a fictional sense, Quentin. You might as well say Cliff is half Kryptonian, half Daxamite, trained by Amazon warriors of Themyscira, who was then bitten by werewolves and vampires. He's make-believe, unlike Bruce Lee, who was a real person. Quentin goes on to say, if Cliff fought in a martial arts tournament, he wouldn't stand a chance against Bruce. Why not, Quentin? He's a fictional character. Also, if he's based on Jean LaBelle, as some claim, and as seemed to be inferred by Joe bringing up LaBelle, well, Judo Jean was handy in tournaments. He competed in those types of tournaments, unlike Bruce Lee. And this nicely brings us onto the part where Quentin Tarantino contradicts the movie script, because in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, Bruce's character ridicules the tournaments of the time for not being authentic fighting. As I said, Bruce Lee didn't compete in these tournaments, so the one part of the script where Quentin does have it right, he contradicts himself. Quentin then says that if fictional Cliff, who has fictionally killed people, met Bruce Lee in the jungle, he'd kill Bruce Lee. But any fictional character could theoretically kill anyone in any setting if you wrote it that way. So let's give Quentin some slack, not that he deserves any, and let's say that he really means if Bruce Lee were to face a real Special Forces operative in the jungle, he'd kill Bruce Lee. Again, it depends on how. With a gun, a knife, a booby trap. Quentin doesn't explain any of this, he just assumes Bruce Lee would be jungle chump. Also, Quentin says Bruce Lee is not a killer. Well, just because Bruce didn't kill anyone doesn't mean he wouldn't, or couldn't, if his life was in peril or someone else's life was threatened, like Shannon's or his wife's. And killing was in the Tower of Jeet Kune Do, spelled out clearly. If you break my bone, I take your life. So Bruce was clearly indicating there were times when killing someone may have been a requirement in self-defence. Plus, Bruce was known to have a temper. And here we have another grand contradiction. Quentin says Bruce has never really let loose on anyone. He's always had to keep it together. Hold on, Quentin, you just said he didn't hold back on the Hollywood stuntmen that you claimed hated him. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot. And Quentin, this isn't even true. As I described in my Shale Son video, Bruce beat a guy to submission who challenged him while they were filming Enter the Dragon. And Bruce was involved in street fights as a teenager. So yes, he has let loose in situations where he faced potential peril. Apparently in the book written by Quentin, fictional Bruce can tell by fictional Cliff's stance that he's holding back his instinct to kill Bruce. It's nonsense, Quentin. Utter nonsense. Bruce didn't fight in the Long Beach tournaments because they weren't authentic in his opinion, but Bruce envisioned the UFC years before it became a reality, and he inspired many UFC fighters. In summary, Quentin Tarantino seems to have trouble separating reality from fiction, and seems to have difficulty understanding that real people like Shannon Lee are different to fictional characters. They have feelings and emotions.